Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak here. It's very exciting to be talking at the AIC. As a criminology student, it's kind of the ultimate place. I'm here today to talk about research that I've been doing within the Queensland Police for the last couple of years, and more importantly around some of the findings from the fellowship that I was fortunate enough to be able to go and do some travel at the end of last year. So today's presentation, I'll talk about just a little bit about the online fraud problem in Queensland and give you a bit of a context of that. Talk about the previous research which led to this fellowship, and then the exciting part, I guess, is talking about the fellowship itself and some of the findings. And then at the end, sum up just with some areas that I think need to be changed here in Australia, and certainly there are a lot of areas for future research. Firstly, I just wish to acknowledge the Queensland Police Service for allowing me to go and take an 8-week, everyone in my office says holiday, but it was very tough work to be overseas. The 8 weeks off to go and travel on this Churchill Fellowship. And I'm also extremely grateful to the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, who were the ones who gave me the ability and the money, which in this current climate is very important, to go overseas and do this. And I just want to just say up front that the views expressed in this paper are my views and not necessarily those of the QPS or the Churchill Trust. I always like to start my presentations just with a definition about what fraud is, just so you get an idea of where I'm at in terms of how I've conceptualised a lot of the research that I've done. So I've taken the definition from the ABS, in that fraud is invitation, request, notification or offer designed to obtain someone's personal information or money by deceptive means. So I think one of the key word in that phrase for me is deceptive, and that's why I've bolded it and underlined it. And I think a lot of people within society in general don't necessarily realise the deceptive nature of fraud. People do understand what fraud is, but they don't necessarily realise how it operates and just how deceptive, how a victim becomes a victim. In terms of the categories of fraud that I've focused on in my research, 3 categories. The first is advanced fee fraud. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with that topic. Requests come through asking the person to give a small amount of money in hope that they will get a larger amount of money down the track. So they pay for lots of small amounts of money and the larger amount of money never comes, and victims can lose up to, the highest victim that I've had personal contact with was $7 million. So that's a substantial amount of money. And they can be inheritance, lottery or business investment frauds. The second type is phishing emails. I'm sure a lot of you have had them. I've had countless ones in my inbox where it's from a bank or another organisation asking you to confirm your personal information. You either respond to the email or click on a link and type in all of your personal information. And the last category is romance fraud, which is probably it's the fastest growing type of fraud in Queensland, where people go on social networking, online dating websites, strike up what they perceive to be legitimate relationships, and down the track the request comes through for money and they lose tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they're probably the most insidious because the victims don't only lose their money, but these types of frauds destroy the victim because it's all around the relationship aspect, it's around love, it's around a lot more than money. So just to give you an idea about the extent of the problem, Queensland Police first started to, I guess, be aware of this problem back in 2006. There was anecdotal evidence provided to the Fraud and Corporate Crime Group that this was a problem, but as it wouldn't surprise any of you, when the police went to the stats, there was nothing there. There were no crimes that had been reported in this category. So what the Queensland Police did was Operation Echo Track, where they were able to get the details of 139 people that they knew were sending amounts of money to Nigeria. They then called the 139 people to ask them about the circumstances under which they were sending that money, and from that 136 of them were determined to be victims of advanced fee fraud who'd lost in excess of $18 million. And the majority of those victims had no idea that they were involved in something like that. They had no idea that they were victims. They believed in the legitimacy of their experience and their situation, and then suddenly they're getting a phone call from the police saying, actually, we believe you're a victim of crime. 2009, police did a similar operation, Hotel Fortress. Again, they called a number of people, and again, you see a very high level of victimisation with over $21 million having been lost. And again, the same experience where Majority of victims have no idea about their victimisation. And that makes it very difficult then if we're trying to encourage people to report. You can only report a crime if you acknowledge or realise that you are a victim. And in this case, it's certainly not the majority. So the original, I guess, where this all started was back in, would have been 2008, where I was asked to research an aspect of this problem. One of the issues is that there is not really very much knowledge in this area. We don't really have any knowledge about victim experiences and why people do respond to these types of emails. So the project that I did focused on seniors. That's not to say that seniors are the only people who become victims of this type of crime, but certainly seniors, the impact is far greater. So if you're in your 60s or 70s, you lose your life savings, your superannuation, your home, your ability to recoup those losses is limited, if at all. Whereas if you're a younger person, you still have some time in which to be able to try and get your life back on track. So the project originally looked at why seniors choose to respond or not respond to fraudulent emails. So what I was able to do was to actually get out and interview 85 seniors across Queensland. I did that in 72 interviews, so there was somewhere it was husband and wife or a few people in one interview. The most controversial aspect of the research was that I defined a senior as someone who was 50 years or above. So I apologise if that offends anybody. And I was able to talk to people about themselves, so personal details about themselves, their family. It was a very good way, as many of you would know, to build that rapport and to start talking to a person. You ask them about their grandchildren and there's countless stories that they want to tell you. Also about computer usage. There was certainly a variety in terms of computer experience within my sample. So there were those that could tell me computers back in the 40s and 50s when they were probably this entire floor of the building. And then there were those who had only recently, within the last couple of months, started using computers to keep in touch with their family. And then obviously we talked about fraudulent emails. So for this project, it was receiving a fraudulent email. Not all of them responded. So they're the category of non-respondent, whereby they got the email, they didn't respond in any manner whatsoever. It wasn't always because they recognised it was fraud. Sometimes they just either were lazy or they just didn't know, so they didn't do anything with it. And then there were those that did respond. And in some cases it was just to see how far it would take them. So they wanted to engage and see how far they could go before being asked for money. Others weren't sure, so they asked for more information. And others believed the email and subsequently lost personal information or lost a large amount of money. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go and do face-to-face interviews, so I got to travel through a lot of Queensland. Because I think one of the important things is that the internet it's not confined to geographical spaces. So you can be on a property in Western Queensland, have no one around you for hundreds of kilometres, but you still have an internet connection and therefore you're still, I guess, open to victimisation. So I could spend the rest of the day talking about the findings from this research project. You can imagine, having spoken to 85 seniors, I have a lot of stories and a lot of information. But I guess I've just put some key findings up here which have informed the second part of the project. So the first one was that online frauds are complex in nature and specifically target victim vulnerabilities. So I think one of the things that surprised me, which maybe it shouldn't have, was that a lot of the victims were specifically targeted. So I'll give you one example. There was a lady who had her own business. She had an online business website. She received an email to that business website asking her to tender for a contract, which she said in her industry was normal practice. She responded to that, and that's how she became involved and she probably lost $300,000 to $400,000, and she got some other friends and colleagues involved as well, so it was over $500,000. There are those that respond to inheritance emails, and the deceased person is actually a known relative. So I think one of the things that people don't realise now is that with the interest in family history and genealogy websites, that people are putting a lot of personal information about their family tree up online, and I think criminals are seeing the opportunities in that. The second point was around established relationships between victims and offenders. And it doesn't just have to be a romantic relationship. Obviously in romance fraud there is that, I guess, romantic element, but once that trust and rapport is developed between the victim and the offender, across any of the different categories of fraud, it's very hard for a third party to come in and break that, whether it be a family member or a friend or law enforcement. So there is a continual frustration on the part of the police where they will spend hours and hours talking with the person to, I guess, tell them about the situation and to try and convince them that they are a victim of fraud. And then it takes one phone call from the offender that just undoes all of those hours of work, and the victim believes in the legitimacy of the situation. Certainly what I've touched on is the point that victims do not recognise their own involvement in fraud. I guess what I can say in terms of the people that I spoke to is that even the victims, they're able to identify hundreds if not thousands of fraudulent emails across their lifetime, and it's just the one that they responded to was targeted in the right way at the right time, and they just believed that one. So they're able to identify all the other types of fraudulent emails except for the one that they fell victim to. And victims don't go out, they don't wake up in the morning, turn on their computer and decide to become a victim that day. It's not something that a person sets out to do. So it's very difficult then to try and educate people, I think, around the different types of fraud, because one of the difficulties if we're trying to look at prevention measures is that every victim I spoke to, there were similarities in their stories, but there was always a point of difference. There was always something different about their experience which made it unique to them. So that if you had, say, a checklist of 10 points, they might tick 9 of them off. The 10th one doesn't apply to them, therefore they disregard the previous 9. So it's very difficult, I think, sometimes to tailor a prevention message that's general enough but unique enough to hit on the person that it needs to. There's also a very negative stereotype around victims of online fraud. It's much stronger than I expected it to be. So the stereotype generally goes that the victim is greedy, that they're uneducated, that they're lower socioeconomic, and that they deserve what they get. I guess it's the idea that if they're silly enough to respond in the first place, then yeah, they deserve the consequences. And I'd certainly argue from my experiences that there wasn't one single victim that fell into that category. Victims don't do it. The victims that I spoke to did not respond for their own personal benefit. It was either because they believed that they were helping out the person they were corresponding with, or they were doing it to try and improve their family situation, or it was for a specific purpose. So there was one person who was quite ill and needed some medical attention. So they believed in this because they could then use the money to fund the operations and the healthcare that was required. So it's never, from my experience in talking to victims, it's never around that, I guess, that greed element. And there certainly is an underestimation of the value of personal data. So there were a number of people that I spoke to who would never send money. So if they got an email, even asking $5 or $10, would never send it. But if an email came through asking for name, address, phone number, mother's maiden name, sometimes even license and passport details, they would send that through because they didn't actually recognise the value of that information. They just thought it was words, it was personal details, it's harmless. And I had one example where there was a gentleman who didn't think there was any harm in sending a colour photocopy of his passport. He sent that through. He was then quite surprised when immigration called him because someone had tried to enter the country on his passport. And he didn't believe that that could ever have happened. He didn't think the technology was good enough. So I think there certainly is an opportunity where we need to educate people that personal information is just as valuable as cash because it can be traded in the same way. So certainly this research was able to identify some of the many challenges that I think we face in this area. I think one of the great approaches that particularly Queensland Police have is a focus on prevention. So enforcement action in this area is important and it does occur. There are cases where the offenders are brought to justice and put into jail, but I guess that's in the minority. And these types of investigations, as you would be aware, are just very difficult, complicated. You can have an offender in one country targeting a victim here in Australia who sends money to a third country, goes through a fourth and maybe ends up in a fifth country. So it's very difficult from a policing perspective to try and prosecute and to identify the actual offender in these circumstances. So I think prevention is the key. Prevention is what we need to be focusing our efforts on to try and reduce the likelihood that this does occur at all. So the barriers that this research very clearly identified was the complexity of fraud targeted at individuals. So it's like what I said before, every victim that I spoke to had similarities in their stories, but there was always something different. And I think one of the dangers is that if we educate people around one type of fraud, then the offenders then just change something. They change a detail, they change an approach, and suddenly the person's aware of this one approach, but then they're not aware of the new approach. And it's constantly changing. There are thousands and thousands of ways that a person can be approached, I guess through email to send money or personal information. So they can be very complex. There certainly is a lack of understanding about victimisation. So the non-respondents that I spoke to had a very difficult time and were quite negative towards the people that do respond. So there is this idea as well that the losses are just financial. If you're a victim of fraud, you just lose money. And I can tell you that victims of fraud do not just lose money. There are so many other consequences of that victimisation apart from just the monetary losses. There are health problems, depression. Depression certainly features significantly across all victims. There are obviously relationship breakdown. If you're a breadwinner in your family, you lose all the money that you need to support your family, that's going to put a strain on the relationship between you and your family. There is certainly a complacency about victimisation. There is this idea that it will never happen to me. And I would extend that to say it would never happen to me or anybody that I know. So towards the end of my research, I started asking a hypothetical question, that if a family member or friend came to you and told you that they'd been a victim of this type of fraud, how do you think you would react to that? And I very quickly got defensive responses from people saying, it would never happen. No one in my family is stupid enough to do that. Nobody that I know would ever respond to these types of emails. And I think that's highly problematic because we have, for online fraud victims, there is such a stigma associated with this type of victimisation that victims won't tell anybody. So the majority of victims that I spoke to hadn't told any of their family members, they hadn't told their friends. If they had told family members, it was a small portion of what had happened. They might have said they were involved for a few months, whereas in effect it had been a number of years. They might have said it was a small amount of money, whereas in effect it was quite a large amount of money. So the problem is that these victims they're suffering in silence in the community. They don't feel confident enough to come to the police. They don't feel confident enough to even go to their family and friends and get the support that they need. So I think in terms of trying to open up this area, that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks that we face. And I've just covered that with the victim stereotype, that there is this idea that victims are inherently different. So it's not myself or anybody that I know that would respond. A victim is a different type of person. And what was interesting is that even cut across to victims themselves. So they still had the negative stereotypes towards other victims, even having experienced it personally. So I had one instance where there was a gentleman that I interviewed up in North Queensland. He was originally a non-respondent. He'd received emails but never responded, and I interviewed him on that basis. A few weeks later, he gave me a phone call when I was back in Brisbane to confess to me that in the time since I'd met with him, he'd actually responded and become a victim himself. So he had received an email. It was around a business opportunity. He felt it to be legitimate because he would be earning a small amount of income. It was around an online business, and he lost a couple of $1,000s in terms of the setup costs. So he sent away all this money to get the software and to get whatever was being offered to set up his own business, and he lost that money, and he soon realised that he had become a victim of fraud. But even when I interviewed him the second time and asked him whether or not his ideas had changed, having personally experienced it, he was still very negative towards other types of victims. It was just for this one, he didn't identify it. And I think that's the same across every victim. They just don't identify the situation that they find themselves in. So that's the background in terms of how I came to apply for the Churchill Fellowship. So I was very fortunate enough to get the fellowship to study methods for preventing and supporting victims of online fraud. There's certainly while there is work happening here in Queensland, I did feel that overseas jurisdictions are in a better position to us, and I have been very fortunate within Queensland Police that we've hosted a number of international conferences across the last couple of years where we have had speakers from different countries come out and talk about their experiences within their agencies. So I already had a very strong contact, strong network overseas of agencies that I knew I could visit. I ended up going to the United Kingdom, United States and Canada to various agencies there. And it wasn't just law enforcement. I think that it's very important in this space that we don't just focus from a policing perspective. I think it's very important to get the perspective of all the different agencies, because essentially if we're going to have any success in this area, it's got to be a combined effort. It's got to be an interagency approach. So I was able to talk to other law enforcement, but as well as government, non-government and community agencies. There was probably over 30 to 40 agencies that I got to meet with in my time overseas, so it was a lot of agencies. And what I was saying before, it was very interesting, specifically in the UK, there are so many agencies in this space, but as you would imagine, it happens here in Australia, every agency is in their own little silo. So they don't even know what's happening across agencies within the United Kingdom. And I was very fortunate, I guess, to come in and be able to kind of link that information up and even link some agencies together that needed to talk. So at the end of my 8 weeks, I did write a report which is available on the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust website if you're interested. I think it's a very exciting read. It summarises the key findings of my experience, and it puts forward 21 recommendations across 10 different categories, which I don't expect you to be able to read right now. And I'm certainly not in a position to be able to talk about them all today. But what I thought I would talk about is the victim support side. So when I went overseas, it was twofold. It was to look at prevention aspects, so look at what other jurisdictions were doing around preventing fraud, but it was also looking at how other jurisdictions support those victims of fraud. It would be an ideal world if we only had to do prevention and we never had to do victim support, but I don't believe we're ever going to be in that position. So I think whilst we do need to focus on the prevention aspect, we do need to recognise that there will be victims and we need to increase the support available and what we do for them. I think before I get onto just the victim side of it, one of the things that was very interesting was just the fact that online fraud, it's not surprising, but it is a global problem. And I think one of the things that struck me was that I think this is a type of crime that perhaps doesn't have the jurisdictional differences. So across other types of crimes, it's very different context here in Australia to what it is in the UK and the US and Canada. But I think for online fraud, a lot of the characteristics are quite similar and the experiences of victims are quite similar. So when I was in the United Kingdom, I went to the University of Portsmouth and spoke to one of the researchers there, and he had done a fairly similar project to what I'd done that I've just talked about, where he'd interviewed victims around their experiences. And when he was talking to me about the findings from his research project, it was quite surreal because he was quoting sentences to me that I have probably used in my presentation to you. So his findings were so similar in terms of the victim experiences to what I had found out from my victims. And same happened in Canada, that when I was talking to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, they're situated outside of Toronto, so it's a very small little city. And I guess sometimes they do feel quite isolated. And they were very surprised at how similar the problems I was talking about, I guess half a world away, were the same as what they were experiencing. So I think that is a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing in that I think we can learn a lot from what other jurisdictions are doing and try and apply that to our context. But I guess it's depressing that the problem is such a big problem. So if we're talking about victims, one of the most important observations that I experienced was just that other jurisdictions have a greater awareness and recognition of victims of fraud. So victims within Australia, and I guess I'm talking specifically around Queensland, victims are generally associated to be victims of violent crimes. So our legislation in Queensland defines victim in the broad sense, But if you take that a step further in terms of accessing support and accessing services, victims are defined as only victims of violent crime. And I think that is problematic in terms of it obviously excludes my category of victims, and I think it needs to be a bit broader. Whereas overseas jurisdictions seem to have that greater awareness that victims of fraud are considered to be victims, that they do experience, I guess, the impact of crime in a way that we don't necessarily recognise. And I think they have a more realistic understanding of the impact of victimisation. So whereas I've just detailed, there is the idea that victims of fraud only lose money. Whilst I'm not saying it doesn't exist overseas, I think there is a greater awareness of the fact that victims of fraud don't just lose money, but there is all the other consequences of the crime that impacts on their lives. And in saying that, there is a very different approach to victims overseas. So there are a number of agencies that recognise fraud victims may be better served through a combination of crisis intervention and case management approaches. So this was certainly something that I'd never considered before. I had no idea about it, but it wasn't just one agency and it wasn't just one jurisdiction, but it was a few agencies across the 3 jurisdictions that I spoke to. So in terms of crisis intervention, in the context of this, it recognises that fraud victimisation may be symptomatic of wider problems. So there's this idea that if you're a victim of fraud, you're probably not just experiencing fraud in isolation to anything else, but that the fraud victimisation may be symptomatic of other issues and other problems that you're experiencing in your life, whether they're health problems or social problems or welfare problems. And there is a recognition that fraud victimisation in itself does then also lead to other problems. So if you've lost all of your money, all of your life savings, then your ability to provide food on the table for yourself or your family members is compromised. Your ability to pay rent or your mortgage is compromised, so homelessness may be an issue that follows. Certainly relationship breakdown is a really big one, particularly when victims of fraud don't feel that they can share their experiences with their family or friends. So it certainly does put a big strain on the relationship just in general, but then you add that secrecy to it, it certainly just makes it even more difficult. And in terms of case management, there was a recognition from a number of different agencies that fraud victims would benefit from having intensive support and assistance to get their lives back on track. So the UK, for example, in a different area, in their health area, they have a no secrets, I'm pretty sure it's called No Secrets, and it's to do with health of older people, and it's a policy which brings different agencies together to case manage individuals to make sure that they're cared for across all the different sectors, to make sure that it's not just their health, but it's housing and it's welfare and it's all the different, I guess, areas of support that are required. And there certainly was a belief that that approach could be beneficial in terms of looking at fraud victims. And it advocates that agencies work together to address the fraud victimisation in a holistic manner. So again, it recognises that the fraud victimisation doesn't just happen by itself, that there may be factors that have led to that, and then the fraud victimisation itself then leads to a whole number of other issues that the person might need to deal with. There are benefits and challenges to this approach, so I'm certainly not saying that either of these approaches are perfect and that they're easily implemented within any jurisdiction here in Australia. But I think there certainly are benefits in terms of an improved support for victims. Having more than one agency work on all the different problems in a person's life, including the fraud victimisation, it's got to be beneficial in terms of helping them get back on track and getting things together and being able to move forward with their lives. And it's certainly, a number of agencies said it certainly will work for repeat victims. So there are a number of victims of fraud who chronic victimisation. So it sounds terrible, but I'm sure you already know it, a number of victims do get put on what's called a suckers list. So they are defrauded by one person, that person kind of hits a brick wall where the victim doesn't have any more money or won't send any more money to them, so somebody else comes in and tries to then defraud them for a different scheme. I had a number of victims in my study that had been defrauded one way, and then received contact from what was the Nigerian police or from a different agency saying, we know that you've been defrauded X amount of dollars and we've got the offender, he's in custody, we're going to prosecute him, but we need you to send over $10,000 for legal fees. And so the victim, a lot of victims do believe that because the person on the other end of the phone has all the information. They're able to say how much money they've sent, they're able to give all the details, but they don't realise that that's because they are the offender as such. And again, it just re-victimises people. So certainly having this type of approach for repeat victims is seen by overseas agencies to be a better way of trying to handle them and trying to stop their involvement with fraud. I guess the challenges, and these are quite big, is just that any approach of this nature will be time and resource intensive. So any case management approach to an individual, particularly when you're talking about multiple agencies, will involve a lot of time and effort on behalf of those agencies. And in our current economic climate, it's very difficult perhaps to be able to provide those resources that are necessary. And I guess from a policing perspective, it's also, it's not necessarily a policing role. So police, whilst obviously crime prevention is very important, police don't have the time and the ability to be able to case manage a person. Their skills and their time and effort is required in other areas. So it's very difficult, and I know that the fraud squad in Queensland experience this, I imagine it's universal, that they just don't have the time and the ability to be able to give the attention to victims that they need, because what the victims need sometimes is to talk to somebody and just to kind of vent what's happened and to discuss it, and the police don't necessarily have the time and the ability to do that. It's not because they don't want to, and many of them do it, but it's not necessarily their best use of time. So if we look at this approach in terms of an alternative view to conceptualising victims, overseas certainly does have this different approach, and they do focus on supporting victims of non-violent crimes as more of their general business. So certainly from my observations of a number of different agencies, they just don't even think twice about it. It's just part of their normal business, it's what they do. And there are specific examples of support programs that are available for fraud victims overseas, which was certainly one of the areas that I wanted to investigate when I went over there. So there are 3 that I've put up there. 2 are Canadian and 1 is in the United Kingdom. And I think why these work so well, and the only way that we probably could translate them into an Australian context, is they use volunteers. So they don't use the resources, I guess existing policing resources or government resources, but they do have amazing volunteers that actually provide the support that's required. So if we look at victim support in the United Kingdom, Action Fraud is a central reporting agency for fraud in the UK, and they have the ability to take all fraud reports, and they're able to actually issue a crime reference number, so a person can call Action Fraud as opposed to calling the police, and they don't then have to call the police in addition to that. So as part of that call taking process, victims are asked they're asked to rate the impact of the offence. So what happens is the victim calls Action Fraud, they go through the different screens, report their experience, what's happened to them. At the end, the call taker asks them to rate the severity of this type of crime on their lives. And depending on their response, the call taker can then ask them if they would like to be contacted by victim support. And if they say yes, they are then referred to victim support. It's a call centre in Manchester that they are, Action Fraud call centre is in Manchester, victim support's in Birmingham. And they are then contacted from a member of victim support in Birmingham, and they are, I guess, just asked if they're okay. Sometimes a lot of the victims just need to talk to somebody once. They don't necessarily need ongoing support. They just want to be able to say how they felt, how it's impacted on them, maybe ask a few questions, and they are okay with that. But there are obviously a number of victims that need a lot more than that. And Victim Support is a non-charitable organisation in the UK. They have a ratio, I think it's 3 or 4 to 1 in terms of volunteers to paid members. So they do have paid staff, but they do have a lot of volunteers. And they have offices all across the country. So if a person does require that ongoing assistance, they can be referred to a local office, and they can then go and meet with a volunteer, sit down, have a cup of coffee. The volunteer in some cases can go with them to different places if they need an advocate to go to the bank or to go to different agencies to try and get back on track. And yeah, it's an amazing model. If we go to Canada, they have a somewhat similar program called Senior Busters. It originally started as a very small project in 1993 with the Ontario Provincial Police. And originally it was just targeting telephone fraud. Obviously back in the 90s, email wasn't such a big thing. And it was originally very small in terms of just around Toronto. But it now has over 50 volunteers who work a rotational shift basis. And what happens is similar to the UK. The Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre is a central reporting agency for fraud in Canada. So if you're a victim of fraud, you can call the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. If the person is over a certain age, I think it's either 50 or 55, or if they're calling about an inquiry and they're identified to be vulnerable, like an older person who perhaps hasn't responded, but from the questions they're asking is deemed likely to respond in the future, they are then asked again if they would like to be called, if they would like a follow-up call. And with their consent, they're then referred to the volunteers, who then call them the first time to see how they're going, to see if there's anything they can do. And they do have the capacity for ongoing phone calls. So they can call once a week for as long as is needed. And I think, again, this only works through the use of volunteers. And they're amazing volunteers that do this. And there's two ways that the volunteers work in this. They do the phone calls, but the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre also receives different, fraudulent emails and letters from the public. So they then compile a database of all this information for the intelligence purposes of the police. So volunteers, some of them don't want to do that phone call. They don't want to it's too distressing for them to talk to victims. So they do the data input. Whereas others they just love to call a person up and have that conversation. And a lot of people do just need that. They need someone to talk to because they don't feel they can talk to anyone else. So the acknowledgement of victim support is certainly evident in campaigns to promote reporting of fraud. So in the UK, there is a lot of publicity around action fraud, even though there were some agencies that had never heard of it. There is a lot of publicity that the National Fraud Authority tries to put out in the public to get people to be aware of action fraud and who they are and what they do. And I think one of the great things about that is that they do have that support available. So if you're going to encourage people to come forward and report this type of crime, you need to be able to back that up. And the United Kingdom certainly have in place at the moment, through that partnership with victim support, the ability to offer assistance to victims if they do call the centre and report fraud. And I think it certainly does work in a better way because there is that central reporting agency. So United Kingdom has action fraud, the US has the Internet Crime Complaint Centre, which is obviously just online fraud, but still that central reporting agency. And the Canadians have the Anti-Fraud Centre. Whereas I think in an Australian context, it's probably a little bit more difficult because if I'm a victim of fraud, there are any number of agencies that I can talk to. I can phone the police, I can phone Office of Fair Trading, I can phone my bank, I can phone a multitude of agencies who don't necessarily talk to each other. What was also interesting overseas is, I guess it again relates to that support. There are recovery toolkits that are available for victims of various types of fraud overseas. So these were specifically around identity crime in the US and across all different types of fraud within Canada. So if I'm reporting that I'm a victim of some type of crime, identity fraud or another type of fraud, then there's a toolkit's, it's a good way of conceptualising it. So they then send that out to victims, and it may include things like brochures and prevention materials. So if I've been a victim of a certain type of fraud, it might be a fact sheet that gives me details about that type of fraud and how people become involved in it and steps that I can do to prevent it from happening in the future. In some cases, there's a checklist of suggested actions. So if I'm a victim of identity theft, these are the steps that they would suggest that I take. Contact the bank, contact the different agencies to try and establish, I guess, the extent of what's happened and to try and prevent it from happening in the future. In the US, they have draft letters that victims can send to agencies. So they've done the hard work in terms of putting a letter together that a victim can then just insert their name and whatever agency to be able to send that. And it takes away some of the fear that a lot of victims would have. It can be quite overwhelming for a person when they discover what's happened to then try and figure out what they do next. So I think in some ways these toolkits are great because they do empower the victim to actually do something, and it takes away some of that overwhelming feeling of, I just don't know what to do or who to contact. And there's also obviously agency contact details that are sent out to the victim as well, in terms of if they need any support or if they need to contact other agencies to deal with their current situation. The last point that I want to focus on is around the wellbeing of victims. So overseas, there certainly, as is probably evident throughout this presentation, there is a greater recognition of victims and of the experiences that this type of crime has on them. And there's a much greater link, or I should say much greater interest, in the link between suicide and fraud victimisation. So there were some very tragic stories that were brought to my attention while I was overseas. So there was one in particular in the US, and it was a lady, I think she was about 79, so late 70s, early 80s. She'd become a victim of fraud. She'd lost a substantial amount of money that had devastated her and her life. She committed suicide, and in doing that, she'd also involved her brother. She had a brother around the same age who she had involved in the fraud, and he had also lost a lot of money, and she committed suicide. He attempted suicide, he was unsuccessful, and he was then basically in a coma, in a vegetative state. And there was a third brother who hadn't been involved, and I mean, I just can't imagine how he is feeling that his sister has got involved in this committed suicide, the brother has attempted, and there's this third brother that's now trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what happened and how he can move forward. So whilst I don't necessarily think this is a frequent thing, it's not something that happens all the time, there certainly is a greater awareness of the potential of this to happen overseas, and there certainly is a greater awareness of the need to support victims of fraud so that they don't end up at this extreme. So every fraud victim I've ever spoken to has experienced some level of depression, and I guess it's around trying to intervene whilst it will be effective, to make sure that they don't end up at that end of the spectrum. And the US in particular, through the work of the FBI, all of their field agents are trained around suicide prevention because there's a belief on the part of the FBI that victims will reach out. They will reach out a number of times to family members and to their caseworkers, and therefore they train all of their caseworkers and field agents around suicide prevention so that if the victim does reach out, that the assistance will be given to them that's required. So it's certainly a very different way of viewing it compared to my knowledge of how we view it here in Australia, and I think it does have benefits. So I guess the question now is where to from here? It's certainly been great to be overseas and to learn all of this, but I guess the challenge is about bringing it back and about making a difference here. Because ultimately the reason that I wanted to go overseas was to try and improve the situation for victims here in Australia. Having spoken to so many victims in Queensland and sitting at their kitchen table whilst they tell you what's happened and how it's impacted on their lives, it's very difficult to know that there's nothing out there for them. It's very difficult to not be able to point them in the direction of where they can get help and to try and get their lives back on track. So I think it is very important that we realise that fraud victims are people, that they could be our family members, they could be our friends, and that if it were any other type of crime, we would be doing what we can to help and support them. Whereas because they're victims of online fraud, we're not at that stage yet. We don't necessarily give it the recognition that it needs. So I think we do need to recognise fraud victims on a much greater level. We need to be able to talk about it within the community in a way that's not derogatory, in a way that's not negative. Generally, from my research, when people talk about fraud victims, they only do it in a negative way. They only do it in a, I can't believe anyone would be so stupid enough to respond to that email. I can't believe someone would ever fall for a Nigerian scam. It's all in a very negative way. So if your family member or friends are talking about it in that way and you have responded, you're not going to feel confident to come forward and go, well, actually guys, I responded to that and this is what's happened. So we need to try and change the culture around how we talk about it, and we need to try and take away some of the stigma. There is a huge stigma around it, and there doesn't need to be. Everybody, I think what we need to acknowledge is that everybody could potentially be a victim. And that's not to say, that's not to promote fear of crime across the entire community, but it's to say that the people on the other end of these emails are very skilled people, very skilled at identifying a person's vulnerability and weakness, and very skilled at hitting on that very quickly. So everybody here has a vulnerability, and it's just about being targeted in the right way at the right time that increases, I think, the likelihood that one of us even in this room could respond. There certainly needs to be a greater recognition around the impact of fraud. So it's not just about money, it's about so much more than that. And I think it obviously goes with the first one. It's about giving, I guess, bringing a reality to the situation. I have done a number of presentations to seniors groups around this research, and there's generally not one presentation that I've been to where, by talking about it, I guess by giving it some legitimacy, at the end of the presentation I'm approached by someone quietly in the corner who wants to share a story with me because they've responded and they've never been able to tell somebody, or they felt really ashamed and embarrassed about it. So by me talking about it, it's given them the confidence to say, well, actually that did happen to me, and I don't know, hopefully it makes them feel better and more confident to do it. So I think we do need to talk about it more. We do need to give people an actual, I guess, idea about the reality of the situation, because most people have no idea. So when I give these presentations and when I talk about go into more detail about some of the victim experiences within my research, their jaws drop. I would love actually sometimes to have a video camera behind me when I go through some of the stories, just to see the reactions on people's faces, because they honestly have no idea. And it's not because I think society is cruel or is heartless, but I think it's just because they don't have an actual understanding of this type of crime and how it operates and the impact that it has. I think we certainly need to try and improve our assistance to fraud victims. Overseas jurisdictions have great examples of how that has been achieved, and I think it is realistic to think that we can do that within Australia. I think particularly through the use of volunteers, it's worked really well overseas, and I have no doubt that we could get that to work here in Australia. Certainly from a Queensland perspective, I work in the volunteering portfolio. That's one of the areas that I have in my job. And there are so many amazing people out in the community that volunteer their time, and I think would really love the opportunity to do something like this if they knew that it was for a certain purpose and to try and improve the situation for a person's life. And I think we do need to start, obviously, establishing support services. I've just said what we need to do around volunteers. And I do think it would be useful for us to explore these links between fraud victimisation and suicide. I don't necessarily think it is this really prevalent problem, but having said that, I don't think we can ignore it. Fraud victimisation isn't going to decline anytime soon. If anything, it's going to get much bigger. And I think whilst we don't have a huge problem now, I don't necessarily think we wait until we have a problem to start looking at research. So certainly within the US, the FBI does have a monitoring program, and they do monitor the well-being of all of their victims, including fraud victims. And I think that just starting to talk about it and starting to maybe do some exploration, probably not necessarily suicide in particular, but just around the well-being of victims. So how can we improve their quality of life? How can we intervene to try and improve their situation and get them back on track so that they can enjoy, I guess particularly for the older victims, that they can enjoy the remaining part of their lives. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say for today. I have business cards up here if you're interested in asking any further questions. I certainly love talking about this topic, so feel free to ask me any questions about this or the previous research. But I just want to thank you all very much for this opportunity and I hope that that was interesting and informative.